Welcome in, everyone. Today we're diving deep into a case that's equal parts heartbreaking and complex. Yeah, we're looking into a fatal car crash. But you'll see this deep dive goes way beyond just the accident itself. We're going to unpack not only what happened that day, but also the legal stuff that came after and the big systemic issues it all brings up, you know. So our main source for all this is this investigative report. It's from MN Crime on YouTube. It's called The Moment She Realized She Killed Two People. And they really went all in on this case. Like, they got court documents, police reports, witness testimonies, the whole shebang. All that paints a really, really like chillingly complete picture of what went down. So, okay, let's rewind to Easter Sunday, 2021. Imagine a day that starts out totally normal, right? Full of hope and, celebration. And then bam, it turns into this unimaginable tragedy. That's what happened to the families of Dalton and Taylor, a young couple on their way to Easter thing. And then there's Camille and Leon, twin brother and sister, each driving their own car, and they all end up in this horrible crash. The really eerie thing about this case is this foreshadowing. Like, it's straight out of a movie, I swear. So, just a few minutes before the crash, this woman who lives near the intersection, she sees Camille and Leon speeding through her neighborhood. And she's worried about the kids playing outside, obviously, so she tries to get them to slow down. But they just ignored her. Like, they laughed, or could they believe that? She even called 911, or at least she tried to. But it looks like the call never went through. And sadly, like scarily, her bad feeling was right. Witnesses said this intersection was normally pretty safe, which makes what happened even more shocking. They pulled the crash reconstruction data, and it is awful. Camille and Leon were going 114 miles per hour just seconds before impact.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that kind of speed, 114 miles an hour. That means you cover the length of a football field every second.
Right.
They had basically no time to react, This really shows how speed can turn a car into, well, a death trap in a split second.
And the aftermath was just as bad as you'd expect. The MN Crime video has audio from the 911 calls right after the crash. And you can hear the panic in people's voices. It's awful. The cars were mangled. One was on fire. People were trying to help, obviously, but you can tell they were just in shock. I was particularly struck by the testimony from the first officer who got to the scene. Can you imagine seeing the aftermath of a crash at that speed? A car, like, ripped in half.
Right, and first responders sign up for a tough job, but nothing can really prepare you for that.
Exactly.
And it's not just the first responders, right? Think about the bystanders who saw it happen, the impact, the fire, the realization that people died, just like that. That experience, that feeling of helplessness, the sensory overload, it stays with you.
You're so right. The ripple effects of this are huge. And then, in the middle of all this chaos and, heartbreak, the MN Crime video adds this other awful detail, Camille's reaction at the scene. So they got the police body cam footage, right? And you hear her say these things. You'd think she'd be in shock, right? Or feeling bad, worried about the victims. But she's not. She's, like, more worried about whether Taylor is dead. Taylor was the passenger in the other car. And she says this one thing that really got to me. She says, well, she better be.
Yeah, and that statement is really disturbing when you think about it. Now, we got to remember, people react to shock and trauma in weird ways. Our brains go into survival mode, you know what I mean? And we don't always act the way we think we would. But for Camille to be, like, more concerned with blaming the victim than showing remorse, to practically be hoping Taylor was dead, that's not normal. It makes you question her whole mindset right after the crash.
I agree.
It suggests she just wasn't taking responsibility for her part in this whole thing.
Totally. And it wasn't just what she said. Witnesses said she was cold, even aggressive toward the victims' families at the crash. Meanwhile, Leon just shut down completely, It's like they had completely opposite reactions, which just makes this already awful situation even more complex. But then the story changes again. Remember that neighbor who saw them speeding before the crash? Well, she went to the police.
And thank goodness she did, because her statement was crucial to the whole investigation.
I know, right?
It proves that this wasn't a one-time thing, a momentary lapse in judgment or whatever.
Right.
Camille and Leon meant to be speeding, and the fact that they ignored her completely, that tells you everything you need to know. It shows a blatant disregard for anyone else's safety.
Exactly. And as if that wasn't enough, the investigators found something else, something huge. Camille's passenger, Lynn, who was also her best friend, came forward with some new info. According to Lynn, Camille's behavior after the crash was so bad, so morally wrong, that she ended their friendship over it. And what Lynn said, well, let's just say it added fuel to the fire.
Hmm.
She told the investigators that right before the crash, Camille and Leon, each in their own car, were talking to each other through their windows about who could go faster. Can you imagine?
And that changes everything. It's not just a horrible accident anymore, right? Now it's a deliberate act. They were racing, plain and simple. It was all ego and a total disregard for anyone else on the road.
It's insane. And if that wasn't enough, Lynn said something else that's just awful. She told the police that a few weeks after the crash, at a party, Camille and Leon and some family members were overheard laughing and joking about the accident.
Ugh, that's just disgusting.
I know.
It's one thing to make a mistake, a horrible mistake, but to have zero remorse, to not even acknowledge the pain they caused, to joke about two people dying, that's a special kind of messed up.
It really is. So with all this evidence piling up against her, Camille was charged with 2 counts of third-degree murder, 2 counts of criminal vehicular homicide, and a whole bunch of other charges. But, and this is where things get really complicated, Camille's brother Leon was only 17 when this all happened.
And this is where we get into the very, very messy world of the juvenile justice system. Now, the system is supposed to prioritize rehabilitation over punishment, at least in theory. And while that's a noble goal, in a case as serious as this one, you have to ask, can rehabilitation really work here? And more importantly, should it come at the cost of justice for the victims?
Those are tough questions.
These are questions that society's always struggled with, and this case brings them into sharp focus.
It does. And in Leon's case, these questions became the center of a very messy legal fight. A fight made even worse by a system that's full of inconsistencies and potential conflicts of interest. We'll dig into Leon's case when we come back. But for now, let's take a second and think about everything we've talked about. The reckless choices, the horrible consequences, and the problems in the system that this all brought up. What really stood out to you? What questions do you have? Think about those, because when we come back, we're going to unpack the details of Leon's trial, the crazy stuff that came out, and the incredible story of a mother who just wanted justice for her son. So last we left off, Leon was facing some serious charges. But because he was underage, his case went a totally different way. The question was, would he be tried as an adult or stay in the juvenile system? And this is where Dalton's mom, Veronica, comes in. This woman was driven by grief, obviously, but also this need for justice for her son. And she was a force to be reckoned with, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, and in Minnesota, the process of trying a juvenile as an adult, it's not like set in stone. It's different in every county, which is crazy to me. And this lack of consistency, well, it really comes into play in Leon's case. See, in Dakota County, where this was all happening, they rely a lot on a report from the kid's probation officer.
And here's where it gets really complicated and kind of messed up, to be honest. Remember how Leon was already on probation for assault when this crash happened? Well, the probation officer in charge of his case, the one writing the report, it was the same one who worked with him on that assault charge. Talk about a conflict of interest.
Seriously, that's a huge issue in a lot of these juvenile cases. On the one hand, you've got this probation officer who knows the kid, right? They've been working with them, trying to help them turn their life around. So they might see potential for change, think the kid's not a lost cause. But then again, this personal connection, this hope that things will work out, it shouldn't cloud their judgment,
It's a tough spot to be in, for sure. And to make matters worse, Veronica found out some more things about this probation officer, things that are even more concerning. So the probation officer's report, it only had info up to Leon's 8th grade year. It didn't mention his high school records at all. And guess what? Those records had more assault charges. That's a pretty big thing to leave out, don't you think?
Absolutely. That just screams bias, intentional or not. And sadly, this case isn't unique, It shows how the system can be manipulated, how easy it is for things to get swept under the rug.
Yeah, and it gets worse. Veronica found out later that this probation officer, the one who wrote that report, was also one of the people who voted on whether to try Leon as an adult.
Wait, seriously? So the person who basically controlled what information everyone got to see also got a vote in the outcome? Come on, that's just wrong.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
So as you can imagine, Veronica was devastated. She was trying to get justice for her son, and it felt like the system was protecting his killer.
It's heartbreaking. And it shows how the juvenile justice system can fail the victims,
It's true. In Leon's case, that's exactly what happened. He pled guilty to 2 counts of third-degree murder, but because he was sentenced as a juvenile, he got a really lenient sentence. Probation.
Probation for killing 2 people.
I know, it's hard to believe, right? And get this. His probation basically involved yoga classes and getting his GED.
Are you serious? That's it.
Yeah, it's unbelievable, right? I mean, what kind of message does that send to the victims' families?
It's like their lives, their deaths didn't matter as much because the person responsible was a minor.
Exactly. But here's the thing about Veronica. She didn't give up. She took her grief, her anger, all of it, and she turned it into action.
It's inspiring.
She worked tirelessly with lawmakers to try to make sure no other family had to go through what she did. And she made a difference. Because of Veronica, Dakota County made some big changes to how they handle these cases, how they decide whether to try a juvenile as an adult.
Really? Like what?
Well, for one thing, they made it so that everyone on the panel gets the same information about the kid's history. No more chance of some biased report swaying the vote.
That's huge.
I know, right? And another big one, the juvenile's probation officer can't be the intake officer for the whole process anymore.
That makes sense.
Right, so there's no more conflict of interest. They also got rid of the limit on restitution payments, so now courts can order more money to be paid to the victims' families. I mean, obviously, no amount of money can ever truly compensate for the loss of a loved one, but it at least acknowledges the real impact of these crimes, you know?
For sure.
And finally, and this is a big one, they added a rule that says the panel has to meet again if the psychologist who evaluated the kid recommends trying them as an adult.
Wow, that's a big step.
It is.
So even with all the pain and frustration, she was able to make the system better. It's really incredible.
It really is. But it makes you wonder, what if someone had said something sooner about Camille and Leon's driving? What if the laws were tougher on reckless driving in the first place?
It's impossible to know for sure, but this case is a perfect example of why we need to be more aware, more proactive. We need to recognize the warning signs, know what can happen when people drive recklessly, and speak up if something feels off.
Exactly. So we talked about those changes Veronica fought for, but let's really break them down.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so first off, now everyone on the panel gets the same info about the kid's past, their history. No more chance of some biased report messing things up.
Which is huge. Now it's a level playing field, at least when it comes to the information.
Exactly. And another big one, the kid's probation officer, the one who's supposed to be helping them, they can't be the intake officer for this whole adult certification thing anymore.
Smart move. Takes away that conflict of interest right off the bat.
Right. They also got rid of the limit on how much money families can get in restitution, so now courts can order way more money to be paid to the victims' families. Which, no amount of money can bring back a loved one, but it at least shows that the courts get the impact of these crimes, It's not just a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, there's some actual accountability now.
Right. And lastly, and this is a big one, they made a rule that says the panel has to meet again if the psychologist who talked to the kid says they should be tried as an adult. They have to take a second look at it.
That's huge. It adds a whole other level of scrutiny to the process.
It does.
Honestly, those are some really important changes. Veronica's story, it's tragic, but it's also inspiring. It shows that even one person can make a difference, even when it comes to something as complex as the justice system.
It really does. But it makes you think, right? What if someone had spoken up sooner about Camille and Leon's driving, before the crash? What if reckless driving had tougher penalties, harsher consequences? Maybe this could have been avoided.
It's tough to say for sure, but it makes you think. What this case really shows us is that we all need to be more aware. We have to know the warning signs, understand how dangerous reckless driving is, and say something if we see something's wrong.
You're absolutely right. And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. What can we each do as individuals, as a community, to make sure tragedies like this don't happen? Whether it's fighting for safer roads, pushing for stricter laws, or even just having tough conversations with our friends and family about responsible driving. Every little bit helps, This whole case, as tough as it is to hear, shows us the change is possible, but we got to work for it. We have to stay informed, get involved, and fight for a world that's safer and more just. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.